Hello. Della. All right. Hey, everybody. I see you guys out there, and I am getting things going. I had a little bit of kind of weird. Della. All right. Welcome, everybody. So let's get this going. And let me record this. Excuse me, everybody. I want to make sure I'm capturing this for posterity. And as soon as I hit record. Good evening, everybody. Hi, Clara. Let's kick tonight off. I'm so glad you guys are all here. Good evening, and thank you for being here. You are on Common Ground, the place where we bring our fear in hopes that we can watch it die. Fear is the great divider, and we see that today more than ever. As I say this, fear and bigotry threaten to tear our nation apart. On this show, we seek to strike a blow against that fear that divides us by discussing the most difficult topics with respect, civility, and a mind open to a differing opinion. Simply put, our goal is not to win the argument, but to model the lost art of civil disagreement, especially in these crazy times. I'm happy to tell you that we've found over and over again that when we can discuss our opinions freely, we can form an alliance of reason with our fellow citizens, even when we may not agree. We discover we are not all that different, and it's not so hard to reach common ground. I'm your host, John Lombardo. So glad you're here tonight. Our topic for tonight's discussion, America's African American communities and law enforcement. What the heck is happening? The murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd have served as the match that has sparked not a powder keg, but an atom bomb of race-fueled fury as hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. and all over the world take to the streets to demand an end to what they perceive as systemic racism in America's law enforcement communities. What can we do? What should we do? That's what we're talking about tonight. And as always, on Common Ground, you are part of the discussion. And to kick this off, I want to bring in my co-host, my confidant, and my tailor, Eric Rodriguez. Eric, welcome. Glad you're here.
Hi there.
Hi there. How do you
I
like my background, dude?
prefer seamstress. Hey, you got the banner up.
Huh? And it's not the banner. It's
Virtual.
it's like a, it's a green screen. It's a green screen. I have an extra one if you'd like it. We can both do this. So, guys, welcome. This is Common Ground. I'm John Lombardo, my co-host Eric Rodriguez. And tonight, as I said, we're talking about something I think is so important. I'm so excited to have this conversation. We've got a couple of great guests with us. Eric, before we bring our guests in, I want to ask you a couple questions, and I want to chat with you a little bit. And of course, if you guys have questions out there, please always feel free to type them in. We want you guys involved in the conversation. So let's see. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Eric, it feels to me like something different is happening, and I won't say it's good. I mean, this is challenging, maybe necessary, but it feels like there is an authentic groundswell movement happening, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity for our country to move forward in this moment. What do you think? Do you agree with that?
I do. There seems to be far more longevity to the protests and the conversations that are happening than we've seen in recent years. I see a wider diversity of opinions and people at least supporting the idea of protest when sometimes there seems to be a really strong division. Of course, there is, just as many people are supporting the protests, and the idea of protests and the ideas sort of behind why the protests started, as there are people complaining about the looting and the violence that has happened. So I mean, I think that there's more agreement than I've seen in other times when there's been protesting, and just a wider range of diversity of folks out there, and it does feel like there are more conversations going on about real solutions, about policy issues, and I think that's really positive.
Yeah, I did too. I obviously there's the bad stuff, the negative stuff. I talked about it a little bit. I broke my own rule about getting on Facebook this week. I posted some stuff on Facebook this week about some of the things I saw, but I agree that on the whole, I just think there's an opportunity here for us to just do something different than what has happened before, which is obviously what we need. Obviously, we're not where we need to be. And one of the things that we've been doing lately on the show, with using Zoom, we're able to bring guests onto the show, and that's very exciting for me because tonight we got a couple people that are going to give a different perspective. So it's not just Eric and I sitting here chatting. What was the most interesting thing that you saw out there this week, Eric? What moved you or caught your attention this week?
Most moving thing to me was just how many people were protesting and how many peaceful protesters there were and how many police were. I mean, first and foremost, I have never seen ever with this kind of thing police statements that condemned a police action. I just have never seen that the way that I've seen in this. They typically want to stay out of the news, and I saw statement after statement, video after video of police officers, police chiefs, across the board. I also was moved by the fact that there were protests in other countries in solidarity of what is unjust, and I think that pointing to your comments about something a little different, there seems to be more awareness that there's a systematic change that is needed. It's not just an individual who did something terrible. There's systematic changes that need to take place, and this is the beginning of that conversation.
Yeah, that's what I think too. It seems to me like a lot of times when there's an event like this that really makes the headlines and there's a lot of outrage, I think a lot of people pay lip service to it, and a lot of that is sometimes just wanting to appear to be on the right side of things. And I just feel like there's a deeper sincerity in everybody this time, and that's encouraging to me. But guys, we want to give you more than just our perspective now that we can do that on this show. And so I have a couple of very special guests with me tonight. And now I want to bring on our first guest. He is the founder and chairman of the board at a Work of Faith Ministries. And he is also the chairman of the board at Building Leadership and Community Knowledge, or BLACK, an association of African American civic and community leaders who share the common goal of improving the quality of life among African Americans throughout the metropolitan Chicago area. Please welcome our first guest tonight, Mr. Kenneth Wesbrook. So we're bringing him in right now. And there he goes. Kenneth, if you could turn on your camera for us, we'd be able to see you.
Yes, I am clicking on that right now. How are you?
Hey, Kenneth. Great. Well, thanks for being here tonight, Kenneth.
I appreciate the invitation. Thanks.
Very good. And this is Eric Rodriguez, my co-host, Kenneth. So you guys haven't talked yet. So
hello, sir.
No, good. Hello, Eric. Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Kenneth, I really want to thank you. Like I said, it's so nice to have you with us tonight. You and I had a lovely conversation this week. I'm very excited about this discussion. I want to start off with a question for you and then let you sort of paint a picture for us. A lot of people are saying, and when this started to happen, I felt this way too. A lot of people are saying, how did we get here again? My question for you is, did we ever leave? What's going on out there, and are things worse right now, or is this the way it always is, and we're just more aware of it?
Well, I think there's a quote. I don't know if it's technically attributed to Will Smith or not. Things isn't better. It's just being photographed.
Yeah.
We're just being videotaped. Mm-hmm. And I think most people would say that it's about the same. Situational is what comes up. Things weren't quite as overt as they have been in the last number of years. It had become politically incorrect to do a number of things, and unless there was a direct conflict, usually you didn't see things. But we've seen a resurgence in boldness in the last few years, where politically correct is not necessarily the term that's being utilized at this point. People are very bold nowadays, and they pretty much say what they think.
Yeah, I like that phrase that you used. And so you and I talked a little bit about, obviously people's minds are on all the what can be described as it's unrest and protests, but it's also a whole lot of people from a whole lot of different cultures all over the world coming together to seek the same thing, and it's a good thing. What are some of the emotions for African Americans in the United States that are behind these protests?
I think Fannie Lou Hamer once said, we get sick and tired of being sick and tired. These things have occurred so long. It had become actually stereotypical. It had been humorous. There had been jokes dealing with certain things that have been factual that really weren't funny, but as a coping mechanism, people began to find the humor in any scenario. But as it turns out, it's just been years and years and years of the same treatment, and people are basically fed up. And I think what's happening is the emotionalism has caught up. There's been a lot going on. 2020. I mean, we're just waiting for Godzilla to show up. That's the next step in the things that have occurred this year. Naturally, at this point in time, it's very easy for things to jump off, for people to get fed up at a time when there's so much turmoil. People have been boxed in. People are afraid due to the virus, not really knowing how things are spread, how things come up. Everyone is fearful. Everyone's afraid. So you're already on edge. So it doesn't take a lot to be the catalyst to push everyone over the edge. And I think that's what we've seen recently.
Kenneth, do you think that we would see this level of activity if people hadn't been locked in our boxes for months? So do you think that played a role in this?
I believe it did play a role. And I also believe that a number of things there are a number of contributing factors. It's just the formula to be right. Everything has to be in its place. Everything has to have happened the way it happened. Any one or two things outside of this particular formula probably would have resulted in a different outcome. But in this particular case, the formula was right. It was correct for the outcome that we received. And seeing that it's happened it's multicultural really indicates that the formula is correct, because it's not just African Americans or just Black people that are tired. There are a number of other races that you could almost say, well, what does this have to do with you? This isn't the treatment of your people. Well, actually, it is to an extent. It is the treatment of other people. You could say non-white, you could say non-rich, you can say non-powerful, but it is the treatment of the masses that's become up. And basically, everyone is saying, this is a bandwagon that I don't think should go by. This is one I should get on. Yeah. This is the time that I should let my voice be heard along with others.
Yeah, Eric, I want to bring you into this conversation. And by the way, everybody out there, this is Common Ground. We are talking with Kenneth Wesbrook, the founder of it's Black. And that is an acronym which stands for. Kenneth, tell us what the acronym stands for, and tell us a little bit about your work with that organization.
Stands for Building Leadership and Community Knowledge. And we have actually, this organization has been an initiative of a faith-based organization, which we've run for the last 20 years, which was a work of faith ministries. We started and changing the work and the name to Black Building Leadership and Community Knowledge because we wanted to focus on some issues that weren't being addressed. When we were dealing with family issues, we even got into community organizing. simply because in the helps and support of community, we hit walls that could not be addressed unless you dealt with legislation, unless you dealt with judicial issues, unless you really went in depth to deal with supporting the families. And so we felt like we needed to do something more specific to address the needs of Blacks, African Americans in particular, because the cycle has continued to repeat, and there was no end in sight. It just looked like it was a perpetual motion, a perpetual cycle, and that we were handing down certain traditions from generation to generations. And people talk about looking for a Black leader, another MLK, another Malcolm, someone else to come and lead us to the promised land, recognizing that this is something that must be done internally. We must take charge. The citizenry must say that we're going to lift it up. I'm not looking for a leader. I am a leader. So we do leadership training where everyone is a leader. So you're not waiting for someone else to help you, not waiting for someone else to lift you up. You do it. You become a part. You make a move. You make a call. You make a stand. Stop looking for somebody else to do it. Do it yourself.
So great. I love it. Eric, what do you have for Kenneth? I'm sure you have some thoughts you want to share.
Well, I guess one question do you start with youth? Does the community knowledge start with the youth?
We started, yes, and it's actually, we say families, because some years ago we had a before and after school program, and we were doing the basic academics support. We didn't like to play games with kids. We felt like our students in particular were having trouble academically. So we tried to make everything academically based. And what we found was it became increasingly difficult to truly help students without addressing the needs of their parents. So we found the need to address families as a whole and what the needs of the families were. We found a lot of students weren't getting their homework done because they had issues at home. There were addiction issues going on at home. There were incarceration issues going on at home, lack of employment opportunities going on, families partying in what was supposed to be their bedroom. So kids are up 11, 12 o'clock at night. They can't do their homework. Things are happening. So it was really difficult to deal with the student without meeting the needs of the family. So we tried to be a holistic organization and meeting the needs of families. And yes, we address certain issues with students, but we never exclude the parents or, as we say, the caregivers for these particular students.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
Excellent, and I'm very familiar. I worked for many years in a non-public school and a school that was inside our local juvenile hall. And you described exactly the work that we found we had to do. Just all those exact same issues. It's not possible to deal with a student just as they come to you. You know, there are so many things going on, and in fact, that's one of the things that I think about with the current conversation, the current national conversation. That yes, there was this a terrible murder that took place, and there is a lot of people are discussing racism, and racism is a real problem that we need to wrestle with in this country. And there are so many other issues when we talk about law enforcement and the budgets that go into the law enforcement, and we aren't talking about all of the community issues that are not getting addressed, that lead to some of the problems that that's where my mind is mostly focused. And currently I do some advocacy work as well, and policy and advocating for funds to go in directions to actually support people is where my mind goes.
Certainly.
Well, one of our guests, one of our viewers, made a comment, said the system is designed for your communities to fail. And thank you, Claire, for that comment. I want to expound upon that a little bit. I think one of the reasons we're seeing such an explosive response to this is because the income inequality discussion has been so much at the forefront of the national conversation. And I really believe that poverty is that key issue here, that more and more, in my opinion, our system is designed that any community that is impoverished should fail and will fail, and will be beholden to those who are more and more sort of accumulating the wealth, and thus the power. Do you think that conversation about income inequality commingled with the poverty issues, do you think that's a big part of all of this, Kenneth? Do you think that's accurate, or what are your thoughts about that?
Certainly, I think it's major. In fact, some years ago, when we first started the nonprofit organization, went to a number of meetings around town, trying to be involved, trying to get a seat at the table, trying to understand what was going on. And I realized that a lot of organizations would become defunct if we actually reached our goal in helping and supporting families, if we actually were successful at getting families on their feet. It did not seem, and I took a break for a while, and 5 years later, I go back to meetings and they're having the same conversations with the same people that they had 5 years earlier. Nothing had changed. It was like a time warp. And it really seemed to indicate that there are a lot of powers that profit from the poverty of others. And there are a lot of persons that don't really want an even playing field for whatever the reason, but to make sure that there are products, goods, services, housing, and things in communities that have been lacking is detrimental to some. And most people would think, why? I don't understand why that's a problem. Well, that's in itself is another conversation, why it is a problem. But it is, in fact, a problem. It is, in fact, occurring. And there are a lot of people that really don't want that issue to come up. There are jobs available, but certain jobs to certain people in certain groups, and only so many. And so, we don't want to even bring up, what affirmative action or things of that nature come up. But the fact is, there's always a cap, there's always a ceiling, there's always a limit to how many people of color are going to join any organization, any group, any employment sector, and be able to benefit their families through employment solely.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is Common Ground. We are talking with the founder and chairman of the board of a Work of Faith Ministries. So sorry, I stumbled on that. And building leadership and community knowledge, Kenneth Wesbrook. If you guys have any questions out there for Kenneth or for what we're talking about, please chime in. This is a live show, and we want to hear from you. We had a comment from one of our viewers who said, my dad, it's from Julie, my dad will be 90, has said over the years that there will be no middle class, only lower and upper class. And Pete said, Kenneth, thank you for speaking with us. My question for you is, as you envision an end game or solution to the ongoing disparity, what are the fundamental steps that need to be taken for people of color to be elevated to independence rather than dependence? Thanks, Pete. That's a great question. What do you think about that, Kenneth?
Yeah, it is a great question. It's one of the things that we push, is creating a scenario of which you can provide, and the entrepreneurial spirit seems to reign in that particular area. Being prepared, as a former Boy Scout, being prepared is always key, whether it's education, whether it's information, or even access. If you come up with a great idea, everybody wants to be the person that invents this great thing that, changes the world, and they become a billionaire because they're selling this product, but they're not in their garages working on it. They're not doing any research to determine what need they can meet, or what's something that they could do to actually create something. This is a practice that you have to implement. These are things that you have to do regularly in order to come up with that. This is not a haphazard thing. And I would wager that most of these inventors will tell you the 20 things that they failed at before they came up with the thing that won. And I think one of the things we have to do, if you're going to use the expression picking yourself up by your bootstraps, first want to recognize that some people have no boots at all.
Mm.
Okay, so that's the first thing. Some people that have the boots have no feet. Okay, so then we have to realize that the playing field is uneven for a lot of people to even get to a certain level where they can achieve. But it is essential that the mentality is that I need to do something myself. And this is not to disparage people taking advantage of certain things that the government has to offer, but it should never be a lifestyle. It should never be something that generationally we're passing down to a new generation. That should not be the mindset. It should be this bridge, this gap for this time period where I go from employment opportunity to employment opportunity, or educational opportunity to employment, or employment even to self-employment and entrepreneurialism. It has to be a bridge, and a bridge only, never a way of life. And I think when we cause people to research what their passion is, what their area of help is, or where their gifts and talents will take them, then we'll find more people that will achieve things on their own and can teach that to youth and family members in their communities than just totally rely on something that the government does. And I used to say this to our teams when we were teaching: if you don't want to cause panic in the Black community, you don't have to do a lot other than shut down the EBT system, cut off the link cards. You'll wreak havoc. Okay, because when people can't feed their families, they'll do anything. And that's a major issue. And I think that's what we're seeing right now in poverty, because people are making choices based on their inabilities to feed their families. I know teenagers that are doing certain things because they're the caregivers to their younger siblings, 14 and 15-year-olds that are caregivers in their household, who are making the choices, not because they want to be gang members, not because they want to be thugs, and not because they saw so many videos that it inspired them to be a baller, but because there's no one else to care for their siblings, and they're doing what they can do to put food on the table, literally. And that's an unfair responsibility for 14 and 15-year-olds.
Kenneth, you are a hit with our viewers. You're getting a lot of people. Some of your comments are good point. Yes, exclamation point, profound. We really appreciate you being here. I have a question for you from one of our viewers, Terry Gertzman. She said, "Thank you, Kenneth. Would you touch base on your take on mentorship?" She said, "Who and when?" So I don't know if that's a good enough question, but can you talk a little bit about mentorship?
And I think on all levels, oddly enough, we're just launching the Inner Journeys mentoring program. And we've been trying to do something for some time, because as someone who growing up, I didn't realize I was in so many programs. I had something to do after school every day.
Yeah.
I was in some program. I was doing art somewhere. I was in ROTC somewhere. I was in a music somewhere. I was always somewhere doing something, coming up, and engaged with a number of persons that were giving back to the community through service, that we could engage with, that were also surrogate parents and teachers and people that were sharing information. Mentoring is key to me because, first of all, whether you're religious or not, there's probably some other statement that goes along with this, but the statement of an idle mind being the devil's workshop.
Oh.
The Bible talks about a child left to himself will bring his parents, his mother, to shame. We have to have interactive opportunities for youth coming up, and they have to see something other than professional sports and other than a music opportunity as an opportunity to share their gifts and talents and to generate income. They don't have other options. For instance, we had a youth camp. My parents had a ranch, 174 acre ranch, and we started doing youth camps there. And we went around Chicago, the south side, west side, and got kids that had never been out of an 8-block radius in their community, took them up to the country. And day one, they complain, nobody want to be around no cows, nobody want to be around no stuff, nobody trying to do all this stuff, nobody trying to be out in the woods. Where is the Wi-Fi? Where is the corner store? Where is the so-and-so? I mean, the first day was just, did we make a mistake? Is this ridiculous? Okay, but by day 3, okay, it was a totally different environment. Okay. The students were enjoying the country. They were enjoying the animals. They were enjoying that they could be outside at 10, 11 o'clock at night, walking through the woods and not worry about anybody bothering them. The only thing they had to worry about was getting lost and getting off of the trail and taking a little longer to get back to the cabin than they anticipated. But there was no shooting. There was nobody gonna come and knock you over the head. Nobody with a hoodie over their head that was approaching you suddenly and startling you. None of that was going on. So we had people come up with arts and play and drama. We found out that there were writers in this bunch. We found out there were artists in this bunch. We found out there were entrepreneurs in this bunch, simply because they were allowed to be children again, not caregivers, not on the defense, and they were able to do certain things. So yes, mentoring is key. We have to show that there are other opportunities out there. Some kids don't know that they have an aptitude to be accountants or lawyers or doctors or they don't know that because they've never been given the opportunity. And unfortunately, they adopt criminal records sometimes at such a young age that it makes it difficult to pursue these lines. By the time they get their acts together, so to speak, they're starting out in a hole because they can't pursue this line because they're now a felon. They can't pursue this line because they have these issues. So that mentoring becomes a key to help keep students and adults, mind you, because believe it or not, there are adults that need mentoring.
Oh, yeah, of course, of course. One of our viewers, Carol, who is also a former prosecutor, said, sometimes they choose crime because it's available and seems lucrative. I know plenty of white people who did the same things when they were young, but they were treated as valuable people with potential, not incarcerated, so they were able to recover. Black teens who get in trouble are less likely to have that opportunity and instead responded to the prison culture at an early age. And once again, that's a comment from Carol, who is a former prosecutor. We have another comment from Pete. He said, to Kenneth's point before, since the 60s, the federal government has spent $15 trillion on a war on poverty. Even more has been spent at the state level. Money alone seems to not get to the grassroots level in any effective way. How do we change the paradigm and put the money into the hands of the people who will use it wisely locally? Good question.
That is a great question, and the solution is not an easy one, because I was one that was a proponent of making sure that grassroots organizations, which are key, and obviously that, I guess I'd have to say that at this point, especially being one, but understanding that there are a lot of organizations that aren't as their desire isn't necessarily to help the people as much as to help themselves. It can be a lucrative business. It can be a business with, as they say, job security in it. As long as there's poverty and you're working against poverty, then your job is secure. But at the same time, making sure people are making good decisions is key. And I'll give you an example. The city of Evanston, where I was born and raised, had passed a reparations bill. They were going to allocate $10 million based on the taxing of marijuana sales for reparations. So that was a big issue. A lot of hoopla going up about that. A lot of meetings. Danny Glover comes in, speaks. A lot of groups come in and organize and talk about it. But what we found was, talking to the people, if you put $10 million in the hands of people who are not prepared and wise enough to know what to do with it when they get it, that's a major issue. There are a lot of hurts, trauma-based issues that we're dealing with now, that we have to have some trauma-based workshops and seminars going on to deal with hurts and pains that the community members are dealing with before we even talk about money. That's just, you're talking about putting money in a bag with holes in it if you just disperse it at any weight form. You have the issue that you have lottery millionaires that are become broke years later.
Right.
NBA players that are, making millions of dollars that are broke years later. How does this happen? I mean, it boggles my mind to understand how it's possible to blow through that much money. Yet it's done with regularity. So we must address the fact that we have to change the mindset on how we deal with our finances before we allocate funds to certain families, which means there's a lot of teaching, financial planning, financial management, financial literacy that has to go forth in these impoverished communities. People say, I don't need any financial literacy because I have no money to deal with. Well, it's all about preparation.
Yeah.
What happens if you get some? You want to know what to do with it then.
Success is what happens when preparation meets opportunity.
Meets opportunity.
Right?
That's right.
Very good. Yeah. So, well, Kenneth, ladies and gentlemen, this is Common Ground. We are talking with an extraordinary gentleman, Kenneth Wesbrook. I'm loving this conversation. Kenneth, I want to bring our next guest in and continue this conversation. I want to ask you before we do that, do you have a website or some place where people can go to learn more about what you do, to support you? Is there anything we can do to promote your work?
Well, certainly. You can, I guess it would have been very good to have my information available right now, but
I'll type it into, you give me the website. I'll type it into the.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I can I put it in the chat here?
Yeah, put it in the Zoom chat, or you can just tell me and I'll type it.
Okay. It's a Wix site, awoffinc.wixsite.com/AWOFINC.
/WOF.
AWOF stands for A Work of Faith.
So
Inc.
So I've got awofinc.wixsite.com/AWOFinc. Have I got that right?
That is correct. That is
okay, everybody. That is Kenneth's website. Check out what he's doing. The organization is called BLACK. It stands for Building Leadership and Community Knowledge. Kenneth, you've been more than generous with your time. Will you please stick around? I don't want you to leave. I want you to continue to stay part of this conversation. Is that cool?
Most definitely. Most definitely. I'm here.
All right, great. So glad, guys. We're going to bring on our next guest. We're talking about this very difficult time we're going through as a country, and obviously having a community leader like Kenneth is a wonderful perspective. We also wanted to try to get a law enforcement perspective, and that's not so easy to do because most people in law enforcement that are currently employed can't do that. They're not allowed to talk to media, but we found somebody willing to talk to us, and she's a wonderful human being and also has a pretty impressive background. So she is a former UNLVPD officer and an instructor for Girls on Guard self-defense course for women. So I'm going to bring her in now. Let me get rid of this. And her name is Denise Conner. So we're really happy to have you with us, Denise. Thank you for joining us on Common Ground. It's good to have you here. It takes a second for her video screen to pop up when you're joining. But where is she? There she is. Hi, Denise. Denise, I can't hear you that well. Do you, can you see if you're muted?
Let's see.
It's your sensitivity of your camera because I can hear you when you're close.
Okay,
So
well, I'll stay close.
you just have to scream. So Kenneth, Denise, meet Kenneth and Eric, and really excited to have you here tonight. And I'd like to, to have us all engage in this conversation. And of course, this is Common Ground. It's a forum for discussion. So anybody out there, if you have questions, please chime in. Denise, my first question to bring you on is, can you tell us just a little bit quickly about your background?
Certainly. My relevant background, I joined the U.S. Army back in the 80s, was there for 4 years and honorably discharged. And when I got out, I went to college and got a job at the college to help defray expenses at personnel. After I got tired of that, after 14 years, I decided to join the police force there. And it was quite a changing career. And I ended up teaching use of force classes, defensive tactics, and finally retired after 30 years of service at UNLV. And I truly now what I do is I run around and chase my granddaughter who's 3 years old.
Awesome. Well, I want to ask you a question, Denise. Can you explain the term use of force to us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking. First, I wanted to make it perfectly clear, I'm not speaking for the University Police Department. I'm a private citizen, so but I do have some specialized knowledge about police tactics, policy, and procedures. So about use of force. There is many reasons why police need to use force to effect an arrest, to prevent an escape, for self-defense or to protect another, to prevent damage to property, but that's to a degree. You can never use deadly force to protect property, to quell a disturbance or restore order, to temporarily detain a person, to prevent self-inflicted injury so they don't harm themselves, or to carry out a court-ordered action like involuntary mental commitment or removal of children from a home that needs that removal. So that's the reasons why police use force.
Justified, the justifiable reasons.
Justifiable use of force.
Got it.
And use of force falls under the Fourth Amendment. And that's really important because a lot of people don't understand that it's covered under the Fourth Amendment. I want to read it real fast to you.
Please.
The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. That's the key. That's where it comes in for police. And shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath and affirmations, and let's see, particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized. And so to break that down just a little bit, the seizure is based upon reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Reasonable suspicion is the facts and circumstances which would cause a reasonable officer to suspect a person has been or is about to be involved in a criminal activity, whereas probable cause is where the officer actually has the facts and circumstances that would cause a reasonable officer to believe that a crime had been committed. So reasonable suspicion is I think so. Probable cause is I know so. And the reason why that's important is reasonable suspicion allows an officer to hold the citizen for only the amount of time that it takes to conduct the investigation. For example, traffic stop, they only have the time of the stop, which for, let's say, a red light traffic violation, for the time that the officer takes to call into their dispatch, to get the return, to write the ticket. If the officer smells marijuana coming out of the car, that then gives them probable cause to investigate that crime. Okay, so, and in reasonable suspicion, here in Nevada, the officer can only keep the subject for anything else than a traffic stop no more than an hour. Okay, so that's important for everyone to know that. There's also important to know 2 court cases, because what happens is the Supreme Court decides what makes decisions, and it goes down to the lower courts, which then make the laws, and then training for police is based on the laws. And so
the training from the police is designed around the laws made by the lower courts.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Exactly. And so there are 2 key court cases that it's very important to understand. Graham versus Conner, and look that up if you get a chance, because it's a really good court case. Graham versus Conner, and let's see, Tennessee versus Garner. Graham versus Conner established the objective reasonableness standard for all use of force, whether it's deadly or non-deadly.
And I have a question real quick. I want to interrupt you.
Yes.
Are these state laws? Is this a national law, the federal law?
These are federal laws.
Federal laws. Okay, thank you.
What happens is that the police officers go by the Constitution, and underneath that is federal law. Underneath that is state law, and underneath that is department policy. So the federal law supersedes state law. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay, so the Graham versus Conner established the objective reasonableness standard for all use of force. And there are core elements. And what it talks about is, would a reasonable officer who, under the same or similar circumstances, react the same way or or facing the same or use similar judgments. So it is all judged by the reasonable officer at the scene.
So the standard would be if something occurs. So let me give you an example, a real obvious example.
Yes.
I have talked to many police officers since George Floyd was murdered.
Yes.
Every one of them is not only appalled at the murder, but appalled at the police work. Every one of them says there is no one I know on the force that would have done what this guy did. And there's no one I know that would have stood by and watched that happen. Absolutely. So is that what you're talking about? Like that comparatively to what other people's actions would be, we can judge a standard of behavior for those officers, correct?
Absolutely.
So we can, I mean, I don't think we need to go over that because in the George Floyd case, I've never heard anybody say there's nobody out there who doesn't acknowledge that man was murdered by a very, not only a bad police officer, but probably a malevolent person who was doing something that, the criminal. Did I get all that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. I just wanted to do just real quick. The core elements is if the severity of the crime at issue. The severity of the crime at issue for George Floyd was his passing a counterfeit bill, possibly. Mm-hmm. Okay, mm-hmm. So that's not deadly force. You don't use deadly force for that, right? And then the second thing is whether the suspect is posing an imminent threat to the officer. He was in handcuffs. There's no threat that he could be posing. The third is if he's actively resisting or attempting to flee. He was in handcuffs on the ground. The force is not reasonable.
Right. So I think that we all can agree on that. Denise, I want to ask you a tough question. I don't like putting you in this position, but I'm going to try, and you can tell me not to ask. But I know you are not a police officer anymore. I know you don't represent any agency, anything. I got to tell you, the content that I see all over social media around these protests, there are bad actors in the protesters, no question about it. But the stuff I'm seeing, the behavior of the police is stunning to me.
Right.
Do you have an opinion of what we could attribute that to? What the hell is going on? I mean, do you have an opinion of what we could attribute this behavior to?
Well, what I believe is because firing tear gas canisters, rubber bullets at unresisting protesters is not justifiable. It's not in anybody's policy. Okay, so and what happens is when police officers are called to go to quell something that's going on that's violent. Okay, their job is to run to it, and if they end up knocking over somebody, they're not supposed to stop and fix it. Okay. We don't know what those police officers were running to, although, and I can't speak to it because I don't know.
Sure.
Just like if in an active shooter situation, when police officers go in, they can't stop and render aid. They have to go to the shooter and stop the shooter. So all I can think of is perhaps that's the mindset, but I cannot understand a lot of what's going on. It doesn't make any sense to me.
I'm sorry to ask. I know it's a tough question. It's a tough position to put you in. We've got a couple of comments here. Julie asked, and I think this is for you, Denise, are you familiar with NCPI training? Are you familiar with that?
NCPI.
Julie, we're not familiar with that. None of us are. So maybe you could tell us what that is. We'd love to, I'll talk about it on the show here. So Alicia echoed something that we talked about earlier, Kenneth, a statement that was attributed to Will Smith, that's because they're showing their true colors. It's just being recorded. And we talked about that earlier. It's saying where Will Smith was quoted in 2016, I believe it was. He was on the Stephen Colbert show, and he said, racism isn't getting worse. Racism is getting filmed. Or police brutality, I think is the term that he used. Kenneth, you want to chime in here? What are you, as a member of the African American community living in Chicago, you see this stuff. What are your thoughts about it? What do you think? I mean, you want to chime in, or do you want to stay out of that part?
I think I do, simply because when I hear the definitions that Denise was sharing here, it creates an area of concern for me, because I believe a lot of this seems to be so subjective to the officer,
Mhm.
and how much their training and their background is more important to me than their training, so to speak, simply because how they think is what determines whether they're being reasonable or not when they make the assessments that they're making. Certain things are an issue. I have been seen in certain situations, because we have worked with officers. We do work with law enforcement and things of that nature, dealing with families. And I know of explanations where they said they smelled marijuana with a group of students that I know weren't smoking at all. Okay. But certain situations were brought about to make things seem legitimate, because in most cases, no one is going to dispute the word of an officer. So whatever the officer says is taken as fact, whether it is or is not. And despite the number of movies that come out and the things that show different things, I think the average person still has a certain level of trust and respect for law enforcement officers. So therefore, as a result, we're still given the benefit of the doubt that what the officer says was true. I have experienced too many things myself in my life that have indicated that it's very easy to tick someone off and have them become very aggressive at you, and really generate some attitudes that are less than professional, I'll say. And especially the one that really gets me the most is when you hear officers in video conversations saying, "Stop resisting." Well, you're hitting me with a billy club, and my natural reaction is to try to block you. Okay. It's not a thought that I'm consciously doing. My arm goes up, as a reflex. So if you're using the fact that my arm keeps going up as that I'm a fact that I'm resisting, you just go back to Rodney King in 91. There's no way to stop resisting, because my reflexes are going to continue to try to defend my person.
Mhm.
So a lot of times that subject matter of what a person is doing, what you said, probable cause and reasonable suspicion come up, is really based on something that is questionable, but it's difficult to refute. But a lot of times it causes for people of color to have some difficulties that probably they shouldn't have. And I'm not talking about those that are riding dirty. I'm not talking about those that, as I used to tell my son who was coming up, you guys are riding 5 deep. Your music is up loud. You are smoking in the car, doing something that you don't have any business. So you might as well have a sign up that says, "Stop me," because the odds are we're doing something that we shouldn't be doing. That's not it across the board, but unfortunately, more often than not, is the case, which means that a police officer can actually play the percentages on whether or not this stop is going to turn into something. And that's a major problem for people of color.
We had a guest on the show last week, a young man named Aston Cole, and Aston we've. I'm proud to say we helped him get some traction on this initiative. He wrote, he has a change.org initiative. He's now got over 10,000 signatures about creating some type of federal oversight that is outside of the police department anytime an officer is involved in a killing, creating federal oversight that for any fatal event involving a police officer, because the police themselves at this point. And that is obviously not working. We have a question here from Pete again. A couple of questions. Denise, this one's for you. Can you comment on the so-called blue wall of silence? Why is it so hard for police officers to stand against their own? That's his question.
It's a very good question, and I would. It's something that we all have to look inside ourselves to understand, because what happens with police officers is that we go out and we try to save lives. That's our goal. We're not out there to try to try to cheat anybody. We take an oath and we mean it. And sometimes something happens because when you see the worst of humanity over and over and over again, you can at times not see the best anymore.
Sure.
So that you're seeing things that might not be there.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is why I've been hearing that some of those officers that were involved in his death, that 2 were brand new, and the one who, Chauvin, who killed him, of course, had been there for 18 years, and they knew it was wrong, and they didn't feel that they could talk or speak up because they're so new. And
Well, we all know that peer pressure. We've all been the new guy, and it's particularly strong among males. And I would also say that you guys remember there's a story about a guy who he was one of the lead. I don't know what to call it. I apologize, but he was a lead techie at Google, and they had an internal meeting. And at this meeting, he had come out of the meeting, and they asked for feedback on the meeting, and he stated that there were no women in that industry because women weren't as interested in technology as men. He was lambasted and ultimately fired for that opinion. And then a few months later, the CEO of Google, who was a woman, said essentially the same thing on stage. And Joe Rogan did a podcast on it. But my point in telling that story is, I think types of people are drawn to certain roles in our society. And I think that aggressive males are drawn to police work. They're not the only ones doing it. There are plenty of wonderful cops out there, and some of them are aggressive males. I'm not suggesting that is a blanket statement that can define everybody who's a police officer. But I believe that from what I know, the training and preparation, and also the stress under which, so my friends and family who are police officers, they work 12-hour shifts with 30-minute breaks, several days in a row. There is no psychological upkeep on what they're doing. They're expected to perform at a certain level, and like you said, they just lose. Some people can't handle that. And that needs to constantly be reassessed if you can handle it or not. Clearly, there's a whole lot of people out there wearing badges who can't handle it right now. And I think that's super challenging. That's just my opinion.
John,
Yeah.
I'd like to suggest nobody can handle it. As you know, because we do this show together, I almost every time we have a show, I talk about trauma. And Kenneth and Denise have both talked about very dangerous situations to live and work in. This causes trauma, and people need to have healthy ways to process that trauma. And just so both of you know, my dad was a deputy in the local sheriff's department for 35 years. My sister, 3 uncles. I got a lot of law enforcement in my family. I also, much of my teenage years was on probation, and I have worked in juvenile halls and worked at San Quentin prison, and I've got a lot of experience on both sides of this issue. And as John was just saying, and I've been thinking about this so much, and I've seen video, of course, the video with George Floyd, but other videos that this is such an important part of how do we change what's going on. People have to be trained to speak up. And I've been in those situations. I was when I was a younger man. I saw people acting crazy, and sometimes when you're around that, I don't think cops are any different. You might be a little bit nervous to do something about it, but it's essential I saw this thing that Chris Rock said, that there are some jobs where you can't have a bad day. You like in that job, in that situation, you've got to get it right. I mean, and so part of the training of use of force has to be, if you see somebody next to you, and it's hard for every human being. And so I just think that that's got to be, I keep thinking about how do we fix this, because what are the things, the initiative that John talked about. I mean, I would like to see that not just in police involved death, but any excessive use of force or any injury. I mean, I'd like to expand that more, and there has to be oversight, and there has to be regular citizens that are part of those committees. We've got to have some oversight. And my dad worked in internal affairs for a long time, and I heard lots of stories, and the recommendations for people that did, that had 10 complaints against them, and then they were still not fired. And it's a big conversation. There are unions and yada yada. But and I'm super happy to hear Denise's description of that background, and Kenneth's also that perspective. I would like to hear from both of you if you have any idea of what is the most productive policy change. Where can we put our energy that might help reform this situation?
Well, I believe that everyone needs to know about the excessive force and failure to intervene are federal crimes. And if, like with Aston Cole was his initiative, if we can get that up and have oversight, actual other people's oversight, that will help immensely. And everyone understanding that it is a federal crime, and the statute is Title 18, Section 242. It is that the Department of Justice thoroughly investigates, and where evidence permits, prosecutes the law enforcement officers that are constitutionally violate the law. And that's why it's so important to understand that it's the Fourth Amendment that is being violated, and that you reference that code if there's an excessive force violation. And excessive force is any force that is not justified in light of all the circumstances. I wanted to mention that reasonable officer is not according to that, just that one officer's reasonableness. It's reasonableness of any officer. And that is because of all the training and experience that they would have. I don't know if that helps.
Got it. Yeah, no, thank you.
And I'm sorry, one of the issues that I have concern with is if that is the case, then let's face it, George Floyd is a symbol, because there are so many George Floyds out there, and it's so regularly occurring. It seems to be that, and I know in people of color in our neighborhoods, in African-American neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, this is such a common practice and so commonplace. If that is the case and it's that reasonable, the only thing that it indicates to us is that police officers believe it is reasonable to murder Blacks, because that happens way too often. The fights, the beatings. I mean, we're talking about murder being the ultimate, but we're talking about way more beatings that go on, and that's almost, we don't even discuss that anymore. It happens so often. Guys making it to the station and they're beat to a pulp. That happens so often. Know about police officers that will take what they believe is gang members into rival territories and call them a snitch and then let them out, so that they have to run a gauntlet in order to get back to a safe territory, things of that nature. There's a lot of things that go on when we talk about excessive force. Police officers slamming people to the ground. We've seen them. These have been filmed often. We're talking about pregnant women slammed to the ground. We're talking about people in traffic stops slammed to the ground. We're talking about people. There's a lot that goes on that should not require any type of physicality whatsoever, but it's a resulting factor on a regular basis to people of color, so much so that the situation that occurred with the young lady calling the police on the African-American bird watcher, that to me is almost assault. Okay, because when you're calling the police on me, it says to me that you want me beat down. That's what it says to me.
Absolutely.
You want me hurt. And if you're going to identify me as an African-American man repeatedly, is almost, you're upping the ante. You're not saying there's a man here accosting me. You're saying there's an African-American man here accosting me. Come get him. And odds are that we're going to do something you physically that I can't do, and you're going to be dealt with appropriately. That is all too common in our communities, all too common. And that mentality is the catalyst for what's happening around the country right now, because that happens so often and so much for people that it's like, that's it. Can't take it anymore. Won't deal with it. I don't care what I'm risking. I don't care what happens on the job. And if police officers would turn to their neighbor, as they say, there's a good apple in here. These good apples should be turning in these bad apples a lot more often. There should be a lot more testimonies. There should be a lot more internal investigations and a lot more happenings that are saying that these people are acting inappropriately. Then the community would get the feeling that someone is actually paying attention, because right now there's no confidence that and with regularity police officers going to go to trial, if at all, and if he does, then they're going to be found that their use of force was justified. This is so common that it's comical, okay, to people, that it makes no sense. It happens with regularities. And going by the statutes that you just mentioned and that you just raised, pretty much shows that some people have been very unreasonable over the years, because these things should not be happening with the regularity they're having, giving the information that you just provided.
I would absolutely agree that that is unreasonable. That conduct is unreasonable.
I have to say something about that that incident you talked about, Kenneth. And I'm so grateful to Trevor Noah, who put that video out, that I don't know if I would have fully grasped that as look, I'm a white guy who grew up in Southern California. Not only has no one ever been bigoted toward me, I haven't even seen much bigotry compared to, so I can be very ignorant of these kinds of things. I've had some things happen in my life that opened my eyes to it, but that was such an eye-opening description. And then watching that video with Trevor Noah's explanation of what was happening there really changed my perspective on this issue forever. It was forever to see how that woman weaponized that man's race against him. How she told him, I'm going to tell them an African-American man is attacking me, knowing what that meant. That meant I'm going, as you said, Kenneth, I'm going to put you in danger. She knows as a white woman that just saying that makes the encounter potentially deadly for him as a black man. That is unconscionable. That changed the game for me. It was incredible to see that. Incredible for me. I couldn't believe it. And by the way, that woman is a Democrat liberal who donated to Barack Obama's campaign. So this is not a left-right thing. This is, I think you used the term, and I want to ask you about it, Kenneth. You and I discussed an implicit bias. This isn't so implicit. It's overt, but do you want to talk about that to us just a bit?
Yeah, I think what happens a lot of times is something that my mother told me when I was young. I mentioned to you when we spoke, I was 6 feet tall in 8th grade. Hair began to grow on my face, and I was 190 pounds. There was nothing about me that said 8th grader, okay? And my mother taught me you have to control your temper, and you have to be very cautious on how you're perceived, because you will always be viewed as the bully in any situation that comes up because of your size. People are going to naturally assume that you're physically intimidating. And so you have to have a smile on your face. You have to be very pleasing. You have to go out of your way to make sure that you don't have conflicts, because you're never going to come out on the positive end of any speculation regarding aggression. You're always going to look like the bad guy. So what happens in those situations, we find out in many cases that come up, people begin to draw opinions based on how they were raised, viewpoints that they come up with. If you were to take dolls or pictures or whatever, and you were to say, show me the bad guy, show me the thug, show me the crook, the criminal, odds are any person of color that is in that photo array, in that photo, is going to be picked as that person because they have been indicating that through television, they've been indicating that through news reports and etc. Just as if I were to take a picture of us four right now and say, point to the business owner. Okay, I'm not going to be the first person that they pick. Okay, and so there's certain things that happen. Or if I say, who's the person that owns the company, even Denise and I will be, because they're going to pick an implicit bias means there's going to be a white male even before a white female. So there are biases that come up, that come through our lifestyles and our growth and our development, that isn't necessarily racist by I don't like a certain color, but it's a conditioning that we have received over the years that cause us to form certain opinions, which is why we can have certain persons, at least in our community, when you see police wrestling with a Caucasian man with a gun, and they will wrestle him and move him around repeatedly, but they never say they fear for their lives. But an unarmed African-American male can be shot several times because officers were afraid for their lives. Now, shouldn't the person with the gun be more of a threat than the unarmed person? But because of that bias, that training, it causes them, for whatever reason, to fear that person. And I believe legitimately, I don't believe they're just making it up because if I say that, I can shoot this person and get away with it. I believe they legitimately believe that. And that is the problem. That's more of a problem than if they were making it up.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. That is, we were back in the prior administration, and someone put this in the comments, they were bringing up the 21st Policing Initiative that was brought by that prior administration, and it was being implemented, and it talked about implicit bias, and it was way more than changing the black targets at the range, because for so many years we had black silhouettes at the range when we practiced, and that was why so many unarmed black men got murdered, because that was our mindset. But the implicit bias movement, that the teachings that were involved in that, was way more than that. And it was working, and it was involving the police and their communities. And it was, but A.G. Barr came and he took that away from us. And so I wanted to state that the incidents that Kenneth has been describing were overt racism, and they greatly saddened me because I had no idea that that was still going on, because it wasn't happening in my JD, in my jurisdiction. But my jurisdiction is very small, UNLV. It was very small, so I can't speak to any other police department. But thank you for bringing them up.
And I'm going to say this, Denise. I want everybody watching, this is not the opinions of the other people. This is my opinion. I'm going to state it right now because I think it's relevant to this conversation. But look, Ahmaud Arbery was not killed by police. He was killed by white people who felt that they had the right to go out and shoot him because they suspected him of a crime. I believe that we need to address the fact that we have an administration that has emboldened these types of people to go out and do these kinds of things. That's my opinion. I think it's a huge part of this problem. I'm just putting that out there so everybody knows where I stand on that. I want to, and of course you guys can chime in on that if you have an opinion, or you can stay out of it. It's some people don't want to step on political stuff. Rush had a question. He said, am I crazy since I truly believe that children are not racist at all until they are influenced by society/media? Perhaps a very small group are brought up racist by their parents. Are there millions of kids being influenced as racist by their parents/close friends? How much does media have to do with this? I'm truly asking. I do not mean to be offensive in any way. Nothing offensive about the question, Rush. Thank you for it. What do you guys think?
Well, I'm gonna start out easily by saying I agree 100%. I have friends to this day that we came up with in Evanston. It's a great diverse town, Evanston, Illinois, and we had a lot of white friends coming up. And as a matter of fact, to the extent that I went to more birthday parties for my white friends than I did for my black friends coming up. That was just the way things were. I spent more weekends at my white friend's house than I did my black friends' houses back then. It was just the way things were. And we found that many times youth, and I think we've seen it in memes and even videotapes where you see the black kid and the white kid, they run down the street to each other and they embrace, or
Yeah.
the two kids that wanted to be twins for a school project, the black kid and the white kid that they want to be twins. We dressed alike so no one can tell us apart. Okay. Well, it's wonderful that that's what you think, and really you think that way, because there is no bias that is there that says, well, he's black and I'm white, so obviously they can tell me apart. No, that hasn't entered into their minds yet. That is a conditioning that comes out. And we've seen in movies where after a certain point, back in the day, black kids could play with white kids up until a certain age. And then it became inappropriate to have an ongoing relationship. These things were in place, and even to a certain extent, they're still in place. So it is important that children are taught early on to dispel some of the issues with race, and to change things, because that mindset, as we've seen in recent years, it never went away. People thought it went away, and they're saying it has returned. No, it didn't go away. It just was not politically correct to to share that viewpoint any longer.
And now it is, and it's a little bit more now, isn't it?
Oh, it most definitely is.
That's what I'm talking about.
And I'm a big guy, okay? I'm by no sense a little guy. I'm 6'4", 300 plus pounds, etc. And to say certain things to me says not only are you bold, but you either have something wrong mentally or something, because you're taking a major chance that I decide that I just happen to be a peaceful guy and I'm not going to lay hands on people, but that's not the average person. So if you're saying the things that you're saying to someone and then wonder why, oh, they smacked me, they slapped me, they jumped on me, they yelled at me, except really, and you're surprised? That's what's funny.
Well, listen, we've been talking for a long time. I could do this for hours. You guys are amazing. I love having you here. My wife brought something up that her father was a police officer in Detroit, lived there during the riots, and she grew up there. Della's my wife's name. She has seen the deed to their home that specified that you may not sell the home to a person of color when you moved.
Wow. That
was in 1973. This is not ancient history for the United States of America. This is alive and well in our country. And I don't think that violence is an answer to anything. I don't want to ever see violence, but this back and forth that I see out there from people comparing the apples to apples of, it's a little frustrating to me. I feel like that we have, there is a wonderful experience of actually being United States that awaits us once we can grow out of this crap. And we have failed to do that so far. I hope that's not too indelicate a way to put it.
That's a perfect way to put it. I would hate to get into a tangent of some of those examples of non-ancient history, but I think about the way that the stimulus bill that got passed not too long ago was disproportionately went to wealthy corporations, and it doesn't trickle down, and we know that the poorer communities are disproportionately brown and black, and or you go back to the way that the unfair banking, what happened with the greatest generation, and how black people didn't qualify for those loans. There are some, as Kenneth talked about earlier, with the bootstraps. There are, not everybody has a fair footing to start with, and so as he said, not everyone gets the bootstraps or has the boots, and yeah, John, you and I talked about the other day, Drew Brees' comments, and just how a fundamental misunderstanding of that promise of the United States. And no, to protest against racial inequality, it is honoring the United States and the sacrifice that people made. That's what you promised, and that's what they went out and fought for, was so that we would all be those words in the Constitution, that we would all have access to that, and we haven't gotten there yet. And so that's the work.
Well, guys,
can I say one more thing?
Oh, please, yeah.
I just wanted to say that the protests have been working. Actually, they've been working, and one good thing about it is that they changed all police departments don't have the same tactics, and for example, my former department had spelled it out in policy that they forbid chokeholds to be used, and I'd never heard that chokeholds were being used anywhere, but they apparently were being used as a police tactic in Minneapolis, and that's been changed. They have now banned the use of chokeholds. So protests are working, and they're a good thing.
Denise, that's been happening all across the country, and it's been happening since there was unrest in DC and Ferguson, and so yes, right now there are several organizations and several departments across the country that have done the same thing right now, but that's been happening.
We all need to.
That's the last few years, and so yes, there's some unrest, and there's some property damage, and there's some agitators, and there's some things, but the protests are doing some good. Now,
that's what I said.
I know.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm agreeing with you. And the oversight is still needed so that we make sure that those policies are followed. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Sorry that my tone was off there. I was totally trying to agree with you.
It's okay. I've been fighting on Facebook
Oh no, Denise and Kenneth, I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate you having here, guys. This is Kenneth Wesbrook. I'm going to put Kenneth's information in here one more time so you guys can follow him and check out his website and know more about his work. And Kenneth, Denise, I want you both to promise me that you will come back and do this again with me, please. We are far from done with this conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being here for what is one of the most robust conversations we've ever had. I really appreciate both of you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. Thank you very much.
Bye now, everyone.
Bye, guys. Hope to see you soon. Thank you so much, Kenneth. And I want to thank all of you. You guys have been amazing out there watching. Eric, we've gone way over. I know you and I were going to take a couple minutes and chat here, but what are your final thoughts about the conversation we just had before I do my spiel?
I guess I think I'm encouraged. There are many reasons why I get discouraged. As when I look at the historical events, I look at the fact that there were very similar things going on when we were born. There were both, and it seems as though the tactics on both sides and the expression on both sides hasn't changed all that much. But I feel encouraged by the conversation that we had, and seeing so many police officers and seeing people that are of different communities really saying that this is it, we've got to do something. That is very encouraging to me. And
yeah, me too. It feels different this time, doesn't it?
And it's true. We've seen policies are changing. Now, as I just said to Denise, we have to figure out, this is our work. We have to figure out how to not only push for policy change, but that oversight that we talked about last week, that's got to be in place. We can't expect police departments to police themselves with any kind of integrity. They don't do it. Whether or not they're not capable of it, or most
organizations can't. Most organizations can't self-police. It's not a smart plan.
They don't do it. So I mean, that's the most important thing. The thing that I would say to, as I always say, trauma is serious, and we need to find a way to encourage to help the officers there. And I think that that's crucial. I think that people are going out there with PTSD, and that's part of the problem as well. But this oversight is absolutely essential, and that's work that we could all do. And we can, examine the bias, that implicit bias, the explicit bias that we each have, and our work always starts with us. Yeah. So I've been trying to do my part in getting educated historically about racism, and trying to get more educated about police policy. And that journey is just starting, but that's the work that I'm trying to do, and I would encourage everyone else to do that too.
Well, guys, we're going to wrap up now with my final piece that I call The Way I See It. Gosh, what a great conversation. We'll be back next week doing the same thing, but here we go. So let's see here. Have I got that right, Eric? Have I got the view right?
Yeah, you were on full screen.
Okay, cool. So, ladies and gentlemen, I always wrap the show up with this little bit called The Way I See It. So here it is for tonight. With the volatility of recent events around the U.S. pulsating like a raw nerve for so many, the last thing I want to do is sit here and tell people what they should do, think, or feel. I can only share with you how I feel, what I think, and what I plan to do. So here goes. In one of the most famous speeches ever delivered, Martin Luther King Jr. uttered what I believe to be the highest principle we can strive for as a society. King said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." This is, in my opinion, a perfect sentiment. Had that beautiful dream been realized, we would not be where we are today as a nation, and clearly we have a long way to go to match the ideals immortalized in Dr. King's famous speech. What does it mean to judge one another, not by the color of our skin, by the content of our character? What does that mean? How do we as a nation define the content that gives one a desirable character? I'm afraid we no longer have a clear standard. And as I've watched the events of the last 2 weeks, I'm sorry to tell you that I now believe we never really did, at least not in a way that includes every member of our society. But if I'm right about that, then there's a silver lining and there's good news. It means it's up to us, the people alive now in this moment, to establish some principles that define good character, something we can all agree on as we progress as a society. So back to that question, how do we define a desirable character in our nation? Let's talk about some of the values that we may hold dear as individuals, but have failed to implement as standards for our society. How about charity? I don't know, ask someone and they'll likely say they value charity. But in a charitable nation, it seems like we wouldn't have such rampant poverty, skyrocketing costs for education and healthcare, and homeownership. We wouldn't have millions of homeless veterans who went and served in our military, left to fend for themselves on the streets, all while the richest among us have increased their cumulative wealth by a significant percentage in the last several decades. We as a society don't decry that kind of wealth accumulation. We aspire to it, or at least admire it. We assign a certain celebrity status to the wealthy. They're almost royalty. Never mind how they got their wealth, they got there. And we all gobble up the tales of their extravagant lifestyles with envy. I wonder if a society which values the accumulation of wealth so highly above other things can truly be charitable. What about honesty? Nope. We have created and elevated platforms of communication that ensure that our own agendas outweigh truth-telling. We do that. We drive that behavior. We can't blame the Russians or China or the other side, red or blue. And we have allowed the governance of our country to become so rife with deception that we've elected to the highest office in our land a man whom history will regard as the most prolific liar ever to hold that office. And we knew it when we elected him. We didn't care. Many of us still don't. So it seems to me that we cannot pretend that we value honesty too much, not as a society. How about courage? I know plenty of courageous American people, but once again, as a social value, let's look at the popularity of social media as a communication tool. We rage at each other in the most vile and malicious ways from behind keyboards on the computers whose every deceit we swallow and then regurgitate. And we accept that as normal. This seems to me to be the opposite of courageous. So what comprises character by our collective standard? What are our values? We have them as individuals, we just don't share them as a nation. They aren't codified and standardized socially. And I think I know one of the reasons why. It's because we don't talk to each other anymore. We bury our faces, literally, and hide from one another in these strange virtual worlds we've created on our devices and computers. Social media was supposed to connect us, but it's actually done the opposite. Because it's a one-way street. It's all, look at me, look how interesting my life is. Or, here's what I believe, and if you disagree, screw you. This new method of interaction has undermined our already weak sense of social values, and it's been absolutely catastrophic to the art of communication. In conversation, one's opinion is merely the starting point of an exchange, with a discussion hopefully to follow. On social media, it is the start, the middle, and the end. The user posts an opinion or a statement, and the discussion is over, except for the name-calling when someone disagrees with the opinion. This isn't discourse. It's the democratization of the bully pulpit. Bottom line, the problem with communicating on social media, there is no listening required. And listening is far and away the most important part of communication. It is a skill we cannot afford to lose and in fact must cultivate if we are truly to become United States. Now let's not be naive. Social media isn't going anywhere. So simply being critical of it is pointless. And as we've seen this week, social media can be incredibly useful as a tool for grassroots movements and uniting like-minded people. Like anything, I guess it depends on how you use it. We need to create new habits in our use of social media so we can begin to communicate with one another. All of this is to say that I believe we would know better the answer to my original question, what defines character in our society, if we were better at listening to one another. Right now, we need to focus on doing the best we can. When we do our best, we call the best forth in other people. Gandhi said that, one of MLK's role models. But in order to ask the very best of ourselves, we have to have clearly defined what the best means to us. Once we know, we can start creating that country that Martin Luther King spoke of. But if we aren't committed to that, well, we can name all the streets and holidays after him we want, but we will have ultimately disrespected his legacy and rendered his sacrifice meaningless. One more thing about Martin Luther King and his I Have a Dream oratory. The FBI, which viewed King and his allies as subversives, also noticed that speech. They targeted King specifically as a major enemy of the United States as a result of the speech's popularity. 2 days after King delivered I Have a Dream, a prominent federal agent, William Sullivan, wrote this about King's growing influence. Quote, "We must mark him now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro in this nation," unquote. Soon after, King was murdered. Remember this fact about the character of at least part of America's past, particularly when someone says we need to make it great again. Maybe that former ideal of greatness wasn't always so great for some people. People like African Americans, women, the LGBTQ community, Latinos. These groups are comprised of Americans for whom the phrase land of the free may have rung hollow at times. Maybe we don't need to return to a romanticized version of our flawed past in order to be great. Maybe we can instead inspire to an as yet unachieved version of America. Maybe we can work together to form a society with a common character defined by unity, decency, compassion, and true equality and justice for all people. That would be the greatest version of America yet. Thank you very much, everybody. That's our show. I want to thank our guests, Kenneth Wesbrook and Denise Conner, so much for being here. That was awesome. And by the way, real quick before I go, I want to tell you that if you know somebody that you think should be a guest on this show because they're front line to some of these issues that we are taking on, please message me and let me know. We'd love to have some. We want guests on the show to give us perspectives that we can't provide. Everybody, thank you so much for being out there. We love you, and we will see you all next week. Thank you very much.